All right, we're doing today's lesson a little bit differently. I'll be giving you the lesson via video, and we'll go through the PowerPoint together. There are frogs on the upper left-hand corner for all of the slides that I'd like you to write down. And then next time I see you in class, which will be Monday or Tuesday, I'll be checking your notes. So make sure to go at your own pace. If I'm talking too fast, you're welcome to pause the video and catch up. All right, amphibians. Many of us have seen frogs that either blend in or stand out in their environment. So for instance, if we look at the top images, maybe it took a minute for you to even find the frogs in those images, whereas the bottom three show very conspicuously or obviously colored frogs. So think for a moment, what are the advantages of either blending in or standing out in your environment? You probably got that blending in or standing out helps frogs avoid predators. Now, many of us know that bright coloration is often a warning of toxicity or danger to a predator. So when a predator sees bright coloration, they generally avoid that frog. Now, not all brightly colored frogs are necessarily poisonous. We also have some copycats who have found out that predators avoid brightly colored frogs, and they themselves have evolved to become brightly colored. Whereas up here on the top, we have some very well camouflaged frogs, and they are particularly adapted to avoid predators in their environment. Okay, amphibian classification. Hopefully we know by now that amphibians are in the domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia. They share the same phylum with fish and humans and reptiles and birds, Chordata, and their class name is pretty easy to remember. Amphibians are in the class Amphibia. Some characteristics that all amphibians have in common are that they are vertebrates, meaning they have a backbone. Amphibians are tetrapods, meaning they walk on 4 legs, tetra being 4, pod being foot, so 4 limbs. Amphibians, like fish, are ectothermic, so they rely on the external environment to regulate their internal temperature. And all amphibians must reproduce in water or moist areas. So amphibians will spend their early life in water, and most of them adapt to live their adult life on land. In fact, amphibian literally means double life. There's 2 main groups of amphibians that we'll talk about. Salamanders and newts make up one major group, and frogs and toads make up the other. They share the same general characteristics, but differ on just a few structural and reproductive methods. So salamanders and newts include these guys. They look more like a frog mixed with a lizard, but again, they have the characteristics of amphibians, not reptiles. They are quite diverse. Some have 2 legs, some have 4 legs, some breathe with some breathe with gills, whereas some breathe with lungs. And actually, not all salamanders are this small. In fact, the Japanese giant salamander grows up to several meters in length. So we'll watch the videos in class next time to save you some time going through here. Honolulu Zoo recently welcomed a Japanese giant salamander, so if you get a chance to go see him, that would be great. Frogs and toads, we know, are quite a diverse group. They include everything from cane toads to poison dart frogs. Interestingly, Hawaii doesn't actually have any of its own native amphibian species. So if you've ever seen a poison dart frog or if you have cane toads in your yard, those have all been introduced to Hawaii. That could be because amphibians rely on fresh water, and so it would have been very difficult for them to get here across thousands of miles of salt water. All right, we'll talk about how amphibians meet their needs. So we'll talk about reproduction, movement, gas exchange, and food obtainment. In terms of reproduction, amphibians rely on sexual reproduction. The fertilized eggs develop in water. So most amphibians will lay their eggs in water. However, some may lay their eggs on a moist leaf above the water, and then the babies, once they hatch, will actually fall right into the water. And all amphibians are born very different from the adult form, and so they must undergo a dramatic change, which we know as metamorphosis. So up here we can see some frog eggs. These little tadpoles will, grow limbs, lose their gills, develop lungs. It's a quite drastic change. So frogs and toads and salamanders and newts differ in that frogs and toads rely on external fertilization. So for instance, this frog, actually this is a toad, and it's called the Suriname toad, and the female will actually lay the eggs. The male will fertilize the eggs on her back, and the eggs develop in these little pores on her back until the babies develop and hatch, which is kind of wild. Whereas salamanders and newts, they rely on internal fertilization, but then they will still lay their eggs in water. So here we see the life cycle of a frog and the life cycle of a salamander are relatively similar. They start as eggs, start out in their larval form. Tadpole develops limbs, its tail gets shorter, and here we have the adult frog. A baby salamander looks a little more like the adult, but again, they're developing limbs, eventually losing these gills. It's just that their tail never goes away. All right, so as I just mentioned, part of that metamorphosis involves the loss of gills and fins and the development of lungs and limbs. So if you think of that phrasing, it's pretty easy to remember. You lose gills and fins, you gain lungs and limbs. And as adults, they also develop adaptations for living on land, such as strong hind limbs for jumping, sticky feet. Some are able to produce like a waxy mucus to keep water in. And yeah. All right, their next need that they have to meet, obtaining oxygen. So we mentioned that the young, or the juveniles, have gills. So they're obtaining oxygen through gills, whereas adults generally obtain oxygen through lungs. However, a majority of the oxygen for amphibians is actually just exchanged through the skin. So amphibian skin is so thin that they're able to just absorb oxygen through their skin. However, their skin has to be moist. So there is a species of frog, for instance, that as adults, they don't have gills and they don't have lungs. They just get all of their oxygen through their skin. Now, once the oxygen enters the bloodstream, it's pumped through the body by their heart. And unlike fish, amphibians have a three-chambered heart. So fish, remember, have one atrium and one ventricle. Now, amphibians have two atria, a left atrium, a right atrium, and a ventricle. Now, before we look at the flow of blood, there's two big points I want you to remember. Blood always enters the heart via the atrium. Blood always leaves the heart via the ventricle. So now we just have to figure out which atrium it's entering. All right. Now recall that I said when we're looking at circulatory systems, the color blue represents deoxygenated blood or oxygen-poor blood, and the color red usually represents oxygen-rich blood. So if we look here, we see that blood coming from the body, it's used up all of its oxygen, and so it's going to come back to the heart. Remember, blood coming to the heart always enters through the atrium. Coming from the body, it's going to enter the right atrium. Now, it doesn't have oxygen, so it needs to get oxygen in the lungs. So it goes from the right atrium down to the ventricle. Now it's in the ventricle, so it's about to leave the heart. But right now, it's leaving the heart to the lungs. So it gets its oxygen, and now it has to return to the heart before it gets pumped to the body. It's going to return via the left atrium. Then before it gets pumped out to the body, it goes to the ventricle. So we have blood from the body coming into the right atrium, entering the ventricle, going to the lungs to get oxygenated, comes back in through the left atrium, goes through the ventricle, and now it's ready to be pumped through the body. I would potentially recommend pausing the video for just a moment and just spending some time digesting this image and looking at the flow of blood through the circulatory system of an amphibian. Okay. The next need that they're meeting is obtaining food. Most of the larvae are herbivores, so tadpoles, hang around in ponds and eat algae, whereas adults are carnivores and they feed largely on insects. So some adults will wait patiently for their prey, and others will actually stalk and ambush or hunt their prey, right? A very near miss. If you remember when we watched our insect documentary, this damselfly went on to successfully mate, but oftentimes the frogs are successful. So amphibians are actually very important for controlling pest populations. We'll watch this video of the bullfrog next class. In terms of movement, after metamorphosis, amphibians, like we said, have to develop special adaptations for moving on land. This means that they're going to need a stronger skeleton. So the bones of an amphibian are going to be much stronger than the bones of a fish. Amphibians have very muscular limbs. So if we're talking about frogs and toads, they have very muscular back legs or hind limbs that they can use to jump. Salamanders use their muscular limbs to crawl. And then many also still live that double life, spending some of their time in water. So the webbed feet help them. Now, we always like to look at the ecological impact of what we're learning about, and amphibians are in danger. Nearly half of all amphibian species are at risk of extinction due to human activity largely. So habitat loss, right? We've learned that habitat is destroyed for cattle farms, for fish farms, and for various purposes and development. So as amphibians lose their habitat, they become more at risk. Climate change increases the risk of amphibians becoming extinct, right? So areas that maybe used to be cooler or wetter are becoming drier and warmer. And recall that amphibians, they have to lay their eggs in the water, and they have to retain moist skin to breathe. So climate change is a major threat. Toxins in the environment, so pollution makes them more susceptible to disease. Major fungal infections, something called chytridiomycosis, has wiped out a huge population of amphibians. Invasive species also pose a threat to native amphibians in their environment. And recall that we said amphibians have such thin skin that they can actually breathe through their skin. So as you can imagine, they're particularly sensitive to change, especially when it comes to pollution and toxins in the environment. If they can absorb oxygen, they can also absorb many of those pollutants through their skin as well. So many amphibians die off or are maybe born with deformities and unable to survive and reproduce. So why do we care? As I mentioned, amphibians play a very important role in their ecosystem. They're important pest controllers. So amphibians monitor and level out the insect population. And as we know, insects are major carriers of disease. Amphibians are also what we call an indicator species. So indicator species are organisms that basically indicate the health of the environment. So since they're so sensitive, they're often the first ones to be affected when the environment changes. So if we start to see amphibians die off, we know that the health of that environment or ecosystem is potentially decreasing. So this is all I have for you. Please make sure that you have notes on all of the slides with frogs on them. And we'll review this next class and talk about what we can do to prevent amphibians from becoming extinct.